An old guy is just fine with pickles. Mr. Johnson, the head of the product development department where I work, said such a thing. This was while he was throwing the pickles my parents worked hard to make on the floor. I didn't want food that I had sentimental attachments to be treated so poorly anymore, so I swallowed what I wanted to say and uttered just one phrase. Understood. I never imagined such a thing would happen on the day of the new CEO's inauguration party. Right after that, the new CEO came to us. What the CEO, pale-faced, talked about at a meeting set up later was a shocking truth. I was amazed by the unexpected connection between a certain individual and a company. Mr. Johnson, the head of the department who heard the story with me, eventually came to regret his foolish actions. But no matter how much he regretted it, it was too late. After that, he would be given a merciless decision by the new CEO. My name is Jack. I just turned 35 the other day. Maybe because my family sold homemade pickled vegetables. I've always liked vegetables since I was young. My favorite is cabbage, and my favorite dish is a hot pot that my whole family enjoys together. On days when it was hot pot for dinner, I'd eat nothing but cabbage, to the point where my parents would caution me. Jack really loves cabbage, doesn't he? It's good to eat what you like, but you should eat other vegetables too, see? You won't grow big otherwise. Every time I was cautioned, I'd reluctantly reach for other vegetables like carrots and potatoes, which is a fond memory. So, it was probably inevitable that I, having grown up, joined a food company. When I took the job interview, what I talked about in the company's interview was generally like this. Since my family's home sold vegetable pickles, I became interested in various foods including vegetables. What I said was a common, unremarkable motivation, I think, but it was my honest feeling, without any falsehood. As a child, I only liked cabbage, but as I grew up, I came to appreciate the charms of various vegetables and wanted to work in food industry. Later, after receiving the job offer and joining the company, I worked tirelessly, influenced by my parents' various trials and errors in making pickles at home. I contributed to various product developments in the product development department and built up a track record. Recently, there were whispers around me that it wouldn't be strange if I were promoted to department head soon, but the person who actually became the department head was someone else. However, this person, who had just joined the company, had the ability but had problems with his personality, gradually making the office atmosphere strange. Unlike before, many people worked looking down, and casual conversations during break times decreased. The current product development department was frequently facing major problems, such as work being delayed. Just before noon, having finished a segment of work in the office, I looked up. Looking around, I saw several colleagues with gloomy faces in the same room. Seeing that, after confirming that the department head was not there, I spoke. Let's get some fresh air. It seems stuffy in here. A male colleague at the next desk, who had been silently working until now, looked up. Do you think so? It feels the same as always to me, he said with a puzzled expression, looking around for agreement. It seemed like the other employees, who had been listening to our conversation, also stared at us with troubled faces, not realizing that the usual situation was the problem. They might have gotten too used to the bad circumstances. Seeing the faces of the employees who found working unbearable, I walked towards the window. No, it's stuffy. At this rate, we might get sick. So I'm going to open the window for a bit. Although my colleagues tilted their heads, they agreed, seeing that I was insistent. We hadn't opened the windows recently, and the boss isn't here right now, so why not? Yeah, it might not be bad to feel the breeze while working for a change. In the product development department where I work, there's a new department head, Mr. Johnson. He's a man 2 years younger than me. His rushing of work and forcing overtime had made the employees shrink back. Mr. Johnson, the department head, had previously had papers blown away by the wind, and since then, he didn't like to ventilate the room. So, we usually kept the windows shut, but this made the air inside stagnant. Especially during dry weather, I was worried about the spread of illnesses. But now, since the department head was away, there shouldn't be any problem. So, I'm going to open the window. The pleasant breeze flowing in through the window, opened for the first time in a while, seemed to blow away the gloomy air that had filled the room. Ventilation is important for physical health, but it also seemed to have a positive effect on mental well-being. It feels a bit more refreshing now, doesn't it? Really, it's quite nice. The employees, who had been continuously working under Mr. Johnson's orders, seemed to relax for the first time in a while. There's something else good, too. Everyone, look over there. See the rainbow in that direction. A rainbow coloring the sky was visible where I was gazing out the window. It was worth checking the weather on my phone. While checking work emails, I browsed a weather site and read about the rainbow. The employees who heard about it gathered at the window, letting out sighs of admiration. Beautiful. It's been a while since I've seen a rainbow. It's so clearly visible. Maybe I'll take a picture for the memories. It was quite fortunate to see the rainbow, visible only for a few minutes. Just after the rain had stopped, we decided to take a short break while watching the rainbow, sharing stories about hobbies unrelated to work and talking about our families. Their faces were much more lively than a few minutes ago. However, this atmosphere was shattered when Mr. Johnson returned. "What are you all doing? I don't remember saying you could take a break. Get back to work now." Hearing his words, everyone hurriedly returned to their desks. The air that was lively just moments ago turned cold instantly. The development we're working on is highly anticipated by many. Hurry up and produce results. Currently, in this office, we're developing low-sodium food products for those concerned about their salt intake. If successful, it should contribute significantly to the company's sales. However, driven by greed and the desire for recognition, we had to work under constant pressure from Mr. Johnson, the department head. Mr. Johnson, making loud footsteps, returned to the room. I wondered where he had been. I could smell tobacco on him as he passed by, allowing me to make some guesses, but I set aside any assumptions for now. Who opened the window? I didn't instruct anyone to do that. Mr. Johnson glared at everyone in the department, seemingly obsessed with finding the culprit, questioning each person nearby one by one. Since it was my idea, I couldn't let others be troubled. Reluctantly, I admitted to Mr. Johnson, who was casting hostile glances at the employees, that it was my doing. I opened it. We hadn't ventilated recently. What? Don't do unnecessary things. Opening the window lets the wind in. What if it blows away important documents? Can you take responsibility for that? Indeed, that would be serious. But I had already taken precautions. I understand, but I checked the wind conditions on my phone before opening it, and I thought it's not good to always keep it closed. Shut up. Don't talk back to me, you insolent fool. But Mr. Johnson was not forgiving. His face turned red as he continued to yell at me. Mr. Johnson, quick to anger over trivial matters, often shouted like this, causing those around him to instinctively tense up. The sight of a female colleague nearby trembling seemed to irritate Mr. Johnson even more. Hey, why are you trembling? It's as if I'm intimidating you. I just said what was right. Sorry. The female employee apologized, her voice shaking, but even this seemed to irritate Mr. Johnson. You're overreacting. It makes me look like the bad guy. Go out of the room and stand in the hallway. You're annoying. Yes, Mr. Johnson. With a face about to cry, she hurriedly left the room. I felt terrible for what happened to my colleague. If I hadn't suggested ventilating the room, she wouldn't have been targeted by Mr. Johnson. I was thinking of talking to her later when Mr. Johnson addressed everyone present. The celebration party for the new CEO's appointment is coming up. Don't mess up like you just did and embarrass me. Understand? We don't need people who drag others down in this department. It's a disgrace to the company. Hearing his words, I silently argued in my mind. If anyone's a disgrace, it's Mr. Johnson. He's always intimidating the staff, ruling this department with fear. He's probably the most unnecessary person in the product development department. But I didn't have the courage to say this directly. If you understand, then get back to work quickly, Mr. Johnson said before heading to his desk to start working. All I could do was sigh as I watched him. Later, I sneaked out to the hallway to check on the female employee who was made to stand outside. I thought Mr. Johnson, who was quick to shout and forgetful, must have already forgotten about her. Seeing the right moment, I invited a female colleague back into the office and later decided to make amends for the inconvenience caused to her and other colleagues in the department by giving them some delicious snacks. If Mr. Johnson's behavior had helped progress the work in the product development department, it would have been one thing. However, the employees, intimidated and unable to give their 100%, only slowed down their work pace. This led to a vicious cycle where Mr. Johnson's behavior became increasingly harsh. Realizing that leaving this problem unresolved might lead to people leaving the company, I decided to go back to the place where I used to live with my parents on my day off. Partly, I wanted to see my parents after a long time, but mainly I wanted to consult with a male neighbor. Upon announcing myself through the intercom, I heard a familiar voice. "Hello, it's Jake who called the other day. May I come in?" Jake, it's been a while." "Of course, come in. I've always thought of you like a younger brother. Don't be shy." I was relieved to see his welcoming expression when he opened the door, despite my worry about being a bother. The man who let me into his house, Mr. Anderson, was a man in his 50s, about 20 years older than me. He had been a playmate since I was young, and often looked after me when both my parents were busy with work. He was a kind person who cared whether I was eating properly, and visited me when I was sick in bed. In the living room, Mr. Anderson offered me some tea and cookies, which surprised me as it was a familiar taste. "These are from my company, aren't they?" They were made from vegetables that couldn't be sold as products, intended to be discarded as they didn't meet the standards. We took those vegetables, chopped them finely, and baked them with the cookies. It was a minor product, so I was surprised to see it here. "Yes, I've been working at a branch of your company for a few years now. I try different products to see what they're like." "Is that so?" Mr. Anderson had switched jobs a few years ago. He used to work in an advertising agency but joined the same company as mine, where he worked hard and made his way up. He was inspired to change his career path after being deeply moved by a food product he had tried during a financially difficult time due to an injury. "Pretty soon, I'll be able to share some surprising news, so look forward to it," Mr. Anderson said. Noticing my amazed expression, I wanted to continue discussing this topic, but I reminded myself of the reason I came and refocused. Noticing the change in my demeanor, Mr. Anderson became serious as well. "Actually, I'm having some trouble in the product development department." I explained the situation as clearly as possible, detailing everything that had happened. After listening to everything, Mr. Anderson's expression turned grave. I had a suspicion. I've been researching the people working at the company, and I was particularly mindful of Mr. Johnson. "What? Is there something about Mr. Johnson?" I was surprised that Mr. Anderson, who I thought was just another employee, was doing such research, and I was also curious about Mr. Johnson. He apparently caused some problems at his previous company and had to resign. That company was running low on research and development funds and operational capital, so they took out a loan from a bank. But it seems Mr. Johnson misappropriated those funds. As a result, Mr. Johnson was fired from that financially strapped company and then rehired at our current workplace. The current CEO had a hard time deciding whether to hire Mr. Johnson, but eventually let him work in the product development department, due to the fact that the CEO's parents knew Mr. Johnson's parents and couldn't refuse him. But once the new CEO takes over, the ties that bind will be gone, and it might become passable to fire Mr. Johnson. Really, I didn't know what kind of person would be leading our company as the new CEO, but I thought it was good timing for their appointment. However, will the new president listen to the appeals of ordinary employees like us? Don't worry, I know that person well, and I'm sure they will listen to what you all have to say. Seeing Mr. Anderson's kind smile made me feel glad I had consulted with him. It would be sad to just talk about worries and go home. "Tell me about what's been going on with you." We then spent about an hour updating each other in our recent situations. As I left his house, Mr. Anderson reassured me, "It'll be fine, everything will work out." His confidence made me feel that there was nothing to worry about. Several weeks later, since then, the preparations for the party went smoothly, and the day arrived without any major trouble. The party was held in the most luxurious and expensive hall of a famous hotel, rented out for the occasion. In the meantime, I had been recording Mr. Johnson's behavior in a diary since our last talk. Even though I had consulted with Mr. Anderson, I thought I should do what I could on my own. I shared the information with several colleagues, which helped maintain hope until the new CEO's appointment. Some of the more timid employees were struggling mentally, but they clenched their fists and said, "If the situation improves, we can keep going a little longer," which was a relief. And so, on the day of the party, I arrived at the hotel where the event was being held. There was one more good thing about this party. Mom and Dad were happy when I called them. Remembering the conversation I had just a little while ago, I accidentally muttered to myself. My face relaxed, and I couldn't help but smile. "Never thought the people at your company would be eating the pickles we made," said my dad. "When was the last time you had our pickles, Jack? We've improved a lot since then. Make sure you taste them properly and let us know what you think later," added my mom. Today's party menu featured special cuisines, and it seemed that the pickles from my family's shop were going to be used. I had previously shared them with colleagues from my department, but at this party, employees from other departments would also be participating in large numbers. Thinking about my parents working hard every day, I felt happy that their efforts were being rewarded. It would be good publicity for the shop, so things might get busier afterwards, I thought. Lost in these happy thoughts, I arrived at the party venue before I knew it. Whoops, I need to be careful not to bump into anything while I'm lost in thought, I reminded myself. I couldn't let myself spoil the party, so I pulled myself together and opened the door. Inside, there were already hundreds of participants. Our company has several branches in the region, so the total number of employees must be in the tens of thousands. Still, I had never seen so many people gathered for a company event before. I wonder what the new CEO will be like. I heard there from one of the branches. Someone mentioned nearby. As I observed the venue, I noticed a large stage at the back of the room, where the host and the CEO would probably make speeches. The invited employees were seated around round tables, all seemingly curious about who the new CEO would be, frequently glancing in the direction of the stage. Walking among the employees, I started looking for the seat assigned to me. Searching for my seat in the spacious hall took some time, but a hotel staff member kindly guided me. Upon reaching my assigned seat, I thanked him and saw him off. Then I turned my attention to the table designated for me and noticed Mr. Johnson, my department head, already seated there. It seemed that members of the same department were grouped together. Other familiar faces from my department were also seated at the table. "You're late. I heard that today's dishes are provided by your family's business. Coming late on such a day, aren't you a bit lax?" "Sorry." Taking my seat and feeling unlucky to be placed with him, he continued to lecture me, but after a few minutes, the party began. The host appeared on the stage, smoothly progressing the event. However, when it was time for the meal, something unusual happened. Despite waiting, the dishes never seemed to arrive at my seat, while everyone else at the table was served properly. Confused about what was going on, Mr. Johnson mockingly addressed me. "What's the matter? You seem to be in trouble." It was obvious, I thought, responding irritably. "It seems my meal hasn't been served. There might have been some mistake." "That seems to be the case. Poor you, not being able to eat while all these delicious dishes are laid out in front of us," he said, almost enjoying my predicament. He ostentatiously ate the food served to him, flaunting it in front of me. It crossed my mind that perhaps Mr. Johnson was deliberately causing this trouble. He might have instructed the staff to harass me in some way. As I tried to distract myself by listening to the host on stage, Mr. Johnson wouldn't let me be. He placed a small dish, which was served to him, in front of me. "Since it's so pitiful, I'll give you some of my pickles. Here, eat this and cheer up." Then, with exaggerated surprise, Mr. Johnson said, Right. These are pickles from your family's home. It's such a shame that, at a fancy hotel like this, all you can eat is cheap, country-style pickles." Clenching my fist, I found it too painful to engage in conversation with him, so I silently looked away. But he continued to provoke me, reaching for the pickles in the dish he offered me, and then threw them on the floor. "Well, it doesn't matter. It's just some cheap product sold in any ordinary supermarket. You don't need to eat something that's available everywhere." His mockery of the pickles my parents made was unbearable. "Too much salt is bad for an old body, so I helped you by getting rid of it," he said, grinning at me. Old guys are just fine with pickles. He mocked further. I gritted my teeth in frustration, thinking how he's not much older than me, and replied, "Understood." To prevent any further disrespect to my parents' pickles, I pulled the dish with the pickles closer to me. While I was doing this, the CEO appeared to have arrived on stage. He spoke for a while, but then, for some reason, started running towards us. I was surprised to see him coming straight towards me without a glance to the side, but I was even more stunned when I saw his face. It was Mr. Anderson, the man I never expected to be the new CEO. Just now, my secretary, who was observing the venue, informed me that there was trouble at one of the guest tables. The CEO, who had run up to our table, glanced briefly towards a corner of the room. There stood a burly man holding something like binoculars. Perhaps he was the secretary the CEO mentioned. I noticed an earpiece in the CEO's ear, likely used to communicate with his secretary. As the new CEO, I can't overlook a problem happening right in front of me, Mr. Anderson said. The next moment, he looked at my seat and turned pale. Are you guys trying to pick a fight with the CEO? The only one who reacted to his voice was Mr. Johnson. Seeing Mr. Johnson's confused expression, Mr. Anderson seemed to realize that he was the instigator of the harassment. Your name? He asked. I am Johnson, the head of the product development department, Mr. Johnson replied. I see. It seems I need to have a thorough discussion with Mr. Johnson and Jake after this party. Mr. Anderson's voice was cold. He informed the staff about the issue with my meal and then returned to the stage. Soon after, the proper meal was served to me, but I was too shocked to enjoy it. The next day, I arrived at the office and sighed at the sight in front of me. Mr. Johnson was berating the employees in a clearly agitated manner. What are you so slow? You could have done this faster. The research you did a few months ago was completed much quicker, wasn't it? His loud voice, which once made the employees shrink back, now seemed to inspire them to speak up. In research for product development, each task is different. The time required varies depending on the objective and subject of the research. So it's troubling when you say things like that. This development project simply requires more time. Mr. Johnson, seemingly not expecting a retort, was momentarily speechless before shouting in anger, his face red. Are you saying that to slack off? Are you trying to cover up because the development isn't going well? Remember, it's your responsibility if this fails. I had hoped he might reflect on his behavior after the incident at the party, but it seemed a vain expectation. His attitude was incorrigibly rotten. As I was contemplating how to intervene, a man who had been at the party the previous day approached me. He was the muscular man President Anderson referred to as his secretary, seemingly in his 30s, not much different from my age. His well-built appearance and impressive muscles were noticeable. It seemed he had entered the room without me noticing and was now greeting Mr. Johnson, the department head. I'm Smith. Nice to meet you. I am President Anderson's secretary. He introduced himself to Mr. Johnson, who immediately started acting subservient. Oh, it's a pleasure. I am Johnson, the head of the product development department. I apologize for the unseemly scene. My subordinates can be quite lax. The presence of the president's secretary is indeed impressive. I'm quite taken aback. Ignoring Mr. Johnson's fawning, Mr. Smith spoke to me. Nice to meet you, Jake. Would you please come with Mr. Johnson to the president's office? Yes, of course. I hadn't started on any work yet since I just arrived. Mr. Johnson, twitching the corners of his mouth at the edge of my vision, clearly didn't have the courage to confront Mr. Smith directly. With a forced smile, he said, I don't have any urgent matters, so I'm okay to come along. We then left the room, led by Mr. Smith. As we walked, I thought I saw a familiar face down the hallway. Was it just my imagination? While pondering this, Mr. Smith started a conversation. It seems like you have a tough time every day. Yes, it's quite challenging. Initially bracing for a more serious topic, but realizing it was just small talk, Mr. Smith continued in a sympathetic tone. I understand a bit of what you're going through. I once worked for a terrible boss at a sweatshop. It was tough. That must have been difficult. It's not easy to change bosses. Glancing at Mr. Johnson walking beside us, I thought I saw him glaring at me, but I chose to ignore it. I resigned because I couldn't bear it anymore. And just when I was struggling to find another job, President Anderson offered me a position. So I know there's hope at the end of endurance. I think you and your team have done well." Hearing these words, I felt a warmth in my chest. There were times I had considered speaking up with courage, but many in our department were shy or fearful, making me uncertain about taking such actions. I worried about making the situation worse, so I hadn't been able to take decisive steps. But now, it felt like our perseverance was finally paying off. There's a different way to fight for everyone. The fact that you considered your team members in your actions shows you are a compassionate and remarkable person. Thank you, Mr. Smith. The unexpected flow of the conversation stirred my emotions, and I had to look up to stop tears from spilling over. As we engaged in this conversation, we arrived at the president's office. "Mr. President, I've brought Mr. Johnson and Jake," Mr. Smith announced, opening the door to the office. Mr. Johnson, who had been somewhat out of the loop, and I entered the room. Inside, President Anderson, not just Mr. Anderson, was waiting for us. "I'm sorry to take you away from your work, but let's get straight to the matter at hand," President Anderson began, explaining why he had summoned us to his office. "Normally, we would conduct a thorough investigation with a third party, but given that you're the son of the chairman, I decided it was imperative to resolve this issue promptly." Upon hearing this, I asked, "Excuse me, who do you mean by the chairman?" "Your father," he replied. "It seems your parents haven't told you, but he's actually the founder of this company." I listened in disbelief. According to President Anderson, my father was undoubtedly the founder of the company, who had resigned upon marrying my mother, who originally owned a grocery store. However, he couldn't completely hand over the company's management to someone else and continued to be active as the chairman. He really wanted to focus solely on his wife and the grocery store, but he was a kind, caring man who thought about his colleagues. Reflecting on these words, I recalled the face of my father, whom I had recently met at home. The image of my gentle father, whose presence always conveyed a sense of calmness, came to mind. My father, well loved and relied upon by locals, was always in the midst of people. Thus, I immediately believed President Anderson's story. When I was still at home, I remember important-looking people in suits visiting our house, who might have been from this company. Now that your question is answered, let's move on to the problems you're facing," President Anderson said. I then explained about Mr. Johnson's behavior and the issues in our department. However, Mr. Johnson kept trying to interrupt and dispute my account. "So, Mr. Johnson has been intimidating the staff," I said. "No, that's not true. I haven't been intimidating anyone. Stop spreading lies," he interjected. The conversation was repeatedly disrupted, making it difficult to progress. But after this happened a few times, President Anderson silenced Mr. Johnson with a sharp look, allowing me to explain smoothly. After I finished, President Anderson sighed. "I am disappointed in you. The former president thought maybe you wouldn't cause problems here and might change your ways. I'm sorry, but it's a misunderstanding. I was only trying to motivate the staff for their good," Mr. Johnson pleaded, trembling. His attempts to appeal to President Anderson were met with a cold response. One can never fully understand another person's feelings. "So, I can't deny that you might have intended to motivate them," the president said. Relieved, Mr. Johnson asked, "So, you'll clear up the misunderstanding?" "No, that's not possible," President Anderson replied. "Why not?" Mr. Johnson exclaimed. "Because even if you think you're right, you're imposing your feelings on others and insisting that your opinion is the only correct one." President Anderson stared directly at Mr. Johnson with a serious expression and began to speak. "While a company exists to generate profits, it must first be a place that safeguards its employees. We cannot keep someone who fails to understand the feelings of others." Pausing, President Anderson turned his gaze towards me. "Actually, I secretly observed the situation in your office this morning. Mr. Johnson's behavior was appalling. I didn't understand why he was looking at me until I remembered seeing a shadow when leaving the office. It must have been President Anderson. Jake, did you realize I was there?" "No, not clearly. I was doubtful, and I'm not particularly perceptive," I admitted honestly, unsure how else to respond. President Anderson chuckled at my response and walked up to us. "You're sincere, compassionate, and honest. Maybe you should be the next department head." With a smile, he patted my head as he had when I was a child, then turned to face Mr. Johnson, who seemed to realize his fate. He was sweating profusely. "Mr. Johnson, you've consistently ignored your subordinates' words, insisting on your own demands. You don't understand the role of a department head. It's because they are making unreasonable demands. Have you ever considered the perspective of your subordinates even once?" President Anderson asked, his gaze filled with contempt. "You've created a hostile work environment for petty harassment and intimidation. Moreover, you fail to grasp the current situation accurately. A person like you must leave this company." But how can this be?" Mr. Johnson stammered in disbelief. "Jake, it must have been tough for you and your department. I feel sorry for what you've endured. I need to apologize on behalf of the previous president as well." "No, you don't have to. You just became the president recently. I had my own thoughts about the previous president, but I held no grudge against President Anderson. In fact, I was grateful for his prompt and appropriate handling of the situation. That's all for today. We'll likely conduct a thorough investigation later, and I'll need your cooperation then." "Understood," I responded and promptly left the room. Mr. Johnson, unwilling to accept the situation, started causing a commotion loud enough to be heard outside the room. "Please, don't fire me. I'll do anything. I'll even reflect on my actions." Mr. Smith, who was waiting outside, then escorted Mr. Johnson out of the office. Forced to leave, Mr. Johnson staggered away like a soulless shell. With work awaiting me, I decided to leave Mr. Johnson's matter behind and return to my office. Later, I heard Mr. Johnson was dismissed from the company. Apparently, he had a family, but it seemed they had abandoned him. He struggled to find re-employment for a while, but no company was willing to hire him. Eventually, he returned to his parents' home and got a job at a local factory. However, rumors said he was fired from there too, frequently blaming others for his failures and causing disturbances. No one knew what became of him afterward. Meanwhile, our department's atmosphere brightened significantly after Mr. Johnson's departure. The work that had been stalled due to his behavior started progressing, and the employees began showing more positive and forward-looking attitudes. "Can I open the window for ventilation?" "Of course." "Oh, boss. Let me do it for you. Please focus on your work." I've taken over as the department head in place of Mr. Johnson, managing the work and responsibilities of the position. Though I was initially anxious about whether I could handle the new responsibilities, the support from my team members made it manageable. In the beginning, I was more often helped by my subordinates than the other way around, but I'd like to believe that now I can be of help to them. "It just stopped raining a while ago. We might even see a rainbow," I commented. "Really? It would be great to see a beautiful rainbow like we did last time." A few minutes later, hearing cheers from the employees gathered at the window, I joined them. Witnessing the splendid skies, I felt a sense of fulfillment and returned to my work with renewed energy.